So I haven't been a part of one of your walk and talks before, so I don't know how exactly you like to start them.
Well, this is actually the first one I'm recording. I haven't officially started any others yet.
Okay.
But I've done a lot of these just with random guys on RPC. I just haven't recorded any before this. But I guess probably the best place to start, a lot of people already know who I am. Tell me a little bit about who you are, some of your background, how you found the red pill, what your, what brought you to Christ, a little bit about your testimony, and then your interest in some of the topics that you want to talk about.
Sweet. So my background, I'm Northern Midwest. I'm going to periodically ask if you can still hear me, just because it sounds like we are breaking up just a little bit on audio, but I think my side should be pretty good for at least right now.
I'm just a little windy, so it probably sounds like it's breaking up, but I'm going to go ahead and just mute myself every time I'm not talking.
Okay, sounds good. So grew up Northern Midwest. Indirectly came into contact with like real super like early stage red pill ideologies, like as a child. We had as I was getting carted around by my dad, he had a lot of like the old timey pickup artist stuff. He would have that playing in the car as we'd be driving back from my hometown to where my ex stepmom lived. So it was a pretty long drive. So a lot of the early stage like secular red pill content, or like the infantile stages of it, I'm pretty accommodated to.
So are we talking like the 90s PUAs from So Suave, or is this like even before that?
Honestly, I was like between 7 to like 13 is when a lot of this stuff, when I listened to it, and that would be like early to mid 2000s, and I can't tell you when my dad would ever have gotten any of that. So my hunch is probably mid 90s to early 2000s. Any of that kind of straight pickup artist content is the stuff he would just have playing while I was in the car. Through my faith walk, I was actually introduced more formally to Christ through a close friend of mine, without getting into too much of the boring stuff. Parents divorced really early on, so I got 1 week on my mom's, 1 week on my dad's. And I would actually spend a majority of both of those weeks at one of my friend's houses, and his family was very consistent about going to church. His uncle was a pastor, CRC, so we were always...
CRC?
Oh, well, Christian Reformed, yeah. So CRC...
Just making sure. A lot of people don't necessarily know what the acronyms mean for all the different branches.
Yeah, so I guess I really should say it's Dutch Christian Reformed. So we're talking super, super legalistic. The type of people where you can throw a ball on Sunday, but you can't hit a ball with a baseball bat on Sunday. So really, really high legalism. But that's kind of the background, the religious background that I came from. Turning like 13, 14, 15, like my mid-teenage years, I got more involved in the church, and then obviously because any self-respecting guy starts getting interested in girls at that point, but obviously, like I think a majority of the guys that are a part of the group, at some point you overdo it, and that's where sin comes in and you start stepping boundaries. So that is, for the most part, more or less where I came in for my faith walk. Where I got into red pill formally was within the last 2 years. A lot of the content is, for the secular side of it, is, I mean, pretty close to a lot of the old pickup artist stuff. I have always been really, really consistent with like my boundaries with particularly girls, and that seems to not do so hot as a younger guy, especially in such a feminized time. You tell somebody no once, and it's like their brain malfunctions.
Yeah.
So
I take it, is that around the time that you had found RPC?
yeah, so this is about 2 years ago that I started to look on the married red pill. And then it was probably about a year ago that I started lurking on RPC. And then, yeah, you could probably go back. I can look on my account and tell you.
Now, do I remember seeing you posting on True Christian every now and then as well?
Probably periodically.
Not as much.
Yeah, well, a lot of that stuff I noticed if you said something or if you tried to speak truth and into that environment, you didn't always meet with, like there was a lot of pushback from things that like shouldn't even be pushed back on. So at that point, it kind of becomes throwing pearls before swine. Like, what's the point of me trying to argue with you when you're not trying to even, you're not seeking truth, you're just seeking to be right, and that's kind of stupid. So that's when I moved on to RPC, probably 4 or 5 months before I got engaged, or 4 or 5 months before I got married to my wife, and have just been a part of the community as much as possible.
So you're still pretty newly married within the last year and a half?
Yep. So I got married last October. We've been together for about 4 years. I was 9, no, I was about 20 when we met. So got married when I was 24, so about 4 years.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So I understand that part of what you wanted to chat about today was the, I guess, spiritual realm aspect of the faith. What got you into studying that and making that a priority?
Yeah, so I mentioned it briefly in a post, but my family, about 4 generations, so my grandfather on my mother's side, his mother started interacting more with spiritual warfare. Then as a result, he did, my mom did, and then just because you grow up and whatever you grow up in, you kind of become a part of. So that's how I got started in it. What I have experienced a lot of things personally or firsthand that I like talking about spiritual warfare because it's something that there's a lot of stuff I can say about what Christ has done in my life, and a lot of people can say, well, you just did that because you're a self-starter, because you're somebody who doesn't take no for an answer. But when you talk about, when I was 17 and I was led through praying and laying on hands of my mom, and I literally felt her healed, people are kind of put in a funny position where they either have to call me an outright liar, or they have to begin to kind of come to terms with, hey, maybe there's something more to what you're saying than just,
yeah, I can follow that.
Yeah. So,
so what are these personal experiences you're talking about?
Yeah. So, the one that is most relevant right now, when I was 17, my mom, between the ages of me being 15 and 17, my mom was basically crippled. She really couldn't stand up at all. And it wasn't from her legs, it was from something in her stomach. And we had a guy come in that my mom knew through the church. He had been doing some spiritual intercessory work, and led my stepfather and I through praying and laying on hands of her. And I had my hand on her stomach, and it was literally like I could feel snakes under her skin moving. And both of us, when that started to happen, like we made eye contact with each other, and she was able to stand up for the first time in like several, almost a year at that point was the first time she was able to fully stand straight up. And so like there can be a lot of things that happen, but that doesn't just happen. And for her to have been afflicted by it for so long, and then for it to be fixed when it did happen, it's more than just coincidental for me.
Yeah, that's incredible.
So some things that happened as a child, in that message I talked to you more about it too, but overt spiritual oppression, I did have some instances with that where I mean, not to get into like the paranormal activity type stuff, but there were things that were very obviously like oppressive, more than just like the average. We saw something move or a light flicker. My mom ended up calling in people to walk me through casting demons out, and that took several years of meeting with people, so I had a better understanding of not only what I'm praying for, but having a better understanding of the promises that Christ gives us. And at some point around the same time my mom was healed, all of that stopped. So
yeah, those can be pretty powerful experiences. I remember a time when I was in high school. A good friend of mine, how he came to Christ actually was because he was experiencing a lot of those haunt type things at his house. And we were in band together, and so he sat next to me. We would chat all the time, and he would bring these things up, and you know, I'd be able to talk to him. I think I have an answer for what's going on in your house, dude. And he was, of course, like, oh, anything that you have, this terrifies me. I don't know how to handle it. And so one time he invited me over, and I stayed the night at his house and witnessed with my own eyes all of like probably 5 or 6 times throughout the night. There was just, like you say, flickerings of the lights going on and off, not from short wiring or anything, but like you could watch the switch flip with nobody touching it. And then the TV would just mysteriously turn on with no remote, because I made him give me the remote just to make sure it wasn't him. But like there was a lot of definitely weird stuff going on with that. And so I prayed with him over it. And eventually he joined our Bible study and decided to follow Christ. And I believe within like a month or 2 after that, everything just died away and he never had an issue again. So not to say that, you know, it's very possible that maybe he was kind of making it up, but once he found a place to belong, he didn't feel like he had to, you know, conjure these things. I will say I could not explain looking at what was going on through any normal technical means. I don't know how a switch would flip with nobody touching it. But either way, it was definitely scary. I don't think I'd even told my parents about that because I was kind of weirded out by it. But it wasn't necessarily like a terror type fear as much as it is like, I've never come face to face with this before. And that was one of my first experiences with that myself. But yeah, the fact that it would stop so quickly after he decided to follow Jesus, like raises one of the big questions, which I think is one of the things you might have brought up, or tangentially maybe I brought it up in our private messages, is the idea of, do you think a Christian can be possessed or demonically oppressed, or is that something reserved for those who are not of God?
So to answer the first question, no, I do not believe that they can be possessed. Pretty much everywhere you see in the Bible, whenever somebody comes to Christ, whether it's the legion or the man in the graveyard, once their life is changed by Christ, those demons are driven out. If they are in a situation where their faith is on like borderline, or actually, let me readdress this. I do not believe a spiritually mature Christian can be possessed. at those very early stages, I don't know, and I'm not going to say one way or the other confidently. I do not believe that somebody who is spiritually mature can be, though. Do I believe that a Christian or a spiritually mature person can be oppressed? Yes. I mean, I've seen it, whether it's somebody who, I think this all kind of originated from that conversation about porn, where um, when you're faced with a decision and or like you're scared, and then you're also feeling these things of like arousal or sexual impurity, and you act on one, and then the fear goes away. And that's a really easy way for Satan to get people into habits of acting on sexual impurity or just sin in general. If I act irrationally and angrily, and this other thing, this negative reinforcement goes away, um, then it creates those habits, and it can keep people in bondage. Whether or not it removes them from their salvation, I would disagree with, but I think it ultimately, um, Satan's goal there is not to necessarily remove your salvation, but to rob the joy that you have in this life, which at least to me seems like a big angle that he takes. When he's not able to rob somebody of salvation, he tries to make them miserable on life.
Yeah, I would agree with most of that. I would say that, like you say, there's very little biblical evidence of an authentic believer actually being possessed.
Mm-hmm.
I think in my private messages to you, I worded it to say that it's possible. I'm not totally 100%, but I lean toward the view that no Christian can be possessed.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you know, I leave some wiggle room for the idea that if somebody who is a genuine believer beforehand, whether you want to say they lost their salvation or never were saved in the first place, if they're living in complete defiance of God, you know, there might be some kind of room for that.
Yeah.
But realistically, it's not a very common thing to be talked about in America, at least. I know that lots of people have these experiences, though they're not necessarily publicized massively within the church. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so few things come to mind when you ask that. First is that it just becomes super taboo. If I kind of calling back to what I said earlier, where if I say something like I felt my mom being healed, the person that I'm talking to, if they're an unbeliever, if they're really, really atheist, they believe none of that can happen. They're faced with, I'm putting my character on the line at that point, and they either have to say that I'm bold-faced lying, one, that I'm crazy, two, or that there's something that is really happening. And most people are not willing to put their character on the line like that for a number of reasons. Maybe they think they're going to lose the relationship, or they're going to lose. I got put in the loony bin for a hot minute because my therapist thought I was schizoaffective, and it's like, no, stuff's getting thrown around in my house. Like, I'm not crazy. We have the pictures, we have the broken vases and stuff. I'm not crazy.
Yeah,
So
I can definitely understand that.
When you start putting your integrity and your character on the line like that, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. So that's like the first leg of that answer. The second leg, I think that, and just to clarify, this is something that you had addressed in our messages too. If I say that Satan is doing something, I'm saying it more like a general who is leading an army. So if I say Satan is doing XYZ thing, I mean that by his decree, Satan and the demons that are under his command are doing things. So
I like the analogy you had used in the private messages, where you had basically said it's like saying Hitler killed so many Jews, right? Well, maybe he personally didn't kill them, but it was under his command and authority that it happened, and therefore we still attribute it to him. In the same way, when people say, you know, Satan did this or Satan did that, it's not necessarily him personally, but that it happened under his command or authority.
Right, because he
And
does
I
not
think
have.
Ephesians is pretty darn clear that
Mhm.
there are definitely hierarchies and levels of authority within the demonic realms of how
Yeah.
they plan, strategize, attack, etc.
Mm-hmm. All of it. When you look at that, it's just a bastardized version of what God has put into position, or in place, or how His hierarchies are as well. Like you have the whole shish kebab up in heaven, and then it's just a sinful, corrupt version in hell. But so back to that question though. So why do I think people are not comfortable talking about it in the United States? So that first leg, that people are not willing to put their integrity and character on the line to say it. The second line is because people have somehow been able to separate the spiritual from their day-to-day life. And the media does a great job of helping along with this. Friday nights, you watch the new Ghost Hunters with Zach Baggins or whatever it is. And it's fun and people talk about their ghost stories, but then come Monday morning, it's back to their 9 to 5 grind. And it becomes so separated where you're not necessarily looking for the can flying off the shelf or the toothpaste that's hitting you in the face while you're brushing your teeth. It's your temper when you're talking to your wife or your kids that you can't control. It's the intrusive thoughts about your secretary.
Right.
Can't
So
stop
the question
fantasizing about. Yeah.
that is running through my mind as we talk about some of this is obviously this stuff does happen, but it's not necessarily super commonplace.
Correct.
We know that the enemy is strategic about how they handle things. I assume you're a fan of the Screwtape letters.
Yep.
And so with all of that, why do you think the enemy is so strategic about saying, I'm going to do it to this person, but not those 5,000 people?
Right. When I have personally experienced people going through like demonic oppression, overt demonic oppression, or covert demonic, what was the other word I used for it? But demonic or demons acting covertly to confuse you or to deter you away from moving closer to your faith. The reason they'll pick out individuals, or at least from what I've seen, is because those are people who are in the infantile stages of maybe not necessarily they have converted, but are people that have the potential to convert.
So they would be either easily misled or pulled away from the faith, or people who are close who they're trying to block from ever coming to faith in the first place, right?
Correct. Yep.
That would make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. This is actually something that I'm going to put my brother on blast for a minute. So my brother has seen all of these same things that like he was there. He wasn't there when my mom was healed, but he saw the difference in my mom over the course of one day. We didn't go to the doctor. It wasn't like medication fixed it. And when I told him that it was the laying on of hands, he like totally shut down. He wouldn't talk to me for a while. And it took a while for him to come back. And I have to be real selective when I talk about it because he'll shut down and just leave. Or if we start talking about some of those spooky things that happened in our old house, he's fine with talking about it abstractly, like, oh yeah, these are weird ghost stories. But once we start talking about, well, what's the source of that and why does it happen, he starts getting real squirrely and he shuts down. And to this day, he's not a believer, and that's a relationship that I've been very deliberate about trying to.
So don't you think that those direct experiences would cause people to want to come to Christ? One, to receive protection, or two, because by experiencing supernatural phenomenon, it's kind of a confirmation that, hey, God, demonic forces, angels, all of it's real. And so if you see that, like, why aren't people, what's your take on that, I guess?
Yeah. So I'm actually going to relate that as professionally, I'm a dog trainer. And if we want to talk about making an animal or a human, if we want to talk about getting a behavior to stop, a really effective way, people are consider it pretty unethical to do. I'm neither here nor there on. I see the value to it, but if I want a dog to stop doing a behavior, throw the remote collar on them. They start mounting another dog, or they start trying to jump on the counter and they get shocked. They're not going to go up there again. Even if they know that there's the steak up there, there's the big juicy rack of short ribs, but the adverse condition to them is so great, it's not worth the reward. And because they haven't personally experienced the sense of peace and joy that you can get from having a confident relationship with Christ, they don't fully understand how valuable the thing they're looking at is. Kind of the way I've described it to some of my clients before. If I'm going to compare Christians to drug addicts for a second, so just bear with me. If somebody who's been addicted to heroin for a really long time gets off heroin and then they see it again, there's going to be an impulse or an addictive attraction to that. But somebody who's never been addicted to it, they don't have that same, they don't see the same value in it. And if you talk about the kids that we say, hey, like, drugs are bad, they look at the drug and they don't see the same pull or attractiveness that somebody who's been previously addicted to it or who currently is addicted to it. They don't have that same value system for that substance. Does that make sense? I know that it's kind of strange to compare Christ to a drug, but
it's not the first time I've seen that happen.
So
what do you think is the enemy's overall scheme in perpetrating any type of demonic activity in a person's life? Or even generally, what do you think the enemy's plan is as a whole, even if it doesn't involve direct forms of demonic oppression or appearances, but even just generically with the typical person, what's their overarching goal?
Yeah, so I'm not going to say a number to start off with because I might rant a little bit about it, but for the general populace, his goal is to first illegitimize spirituality. Anything that has to do with the spiritual realm, whether it's good or bad, he wants to make it almost commercialized, or this easy to consume campfire story that doesn't impact your 9-to-5 life.
Is that is it Mark Twain who had said something about how the greatest strategy the devil ever did was to compete or convince people he doesn't exist?
Yep.
Right. So that's the kind of mentality you're talking about, right?
Yeah. Because by convincing people he doesn't exist, he convinces people that the entirety of the spiritual world doesn't exist. And it's stupidly effective. I mean, not to say you should respect him, but you have to understand that he's been on the earth. He's seen millions and millions and billions of people exist. He knows exactly what strings to pull to make people falter and screw up and fall off the path. And one of the easiest ways to do it is just to illegitimize it. He can say, no, what are you talking about? That's not real. God doesn't say, don't do this, or God doesn't say that.
So along those lines, while I'm thinking about it real fast, why is it that we see all kinds of incidents of demonic influence and interjection into human activity, but we don't see angelic?
I think that has to do with ego, where I do have instances where, similar to the healing, where there are things that have happened that I could just as easily say it had my power to do with it. I think it has to do with human ego trying to say, I'm more inclined to benefit myself than I am to hurt myself. So people are more apt to look at the negative things as having some kind of spiritual intercession, as opposed to like, hey, I drove 450 miles on my car and I definitely don't get that much gas mileage and I'm on my last $10. Like, this doesn't make sense. My car should definitely be out of gas.
Couldn't the predisposition toward spiritualizing the negative things, though, just be explained away as people not wanting to take personal responsibility for the crap that happens in their lives?
I think a big aspect of it is some of it is that way. And that's why I like the red pill community so much, is because there's a heavy influence of you have to take personal responsibility for everything. And if you don't, there's going to be some guy in the comments section ripping you to shreds. But that's where I think the secular and the Christian subs kind of differ, because there is an aspect of like, this is where God has worked in my life to either help me help myself, or he has just overtly helped me. When I was just out of college, I dropped out at 19 because whatever. I remember having $20, maybe $10 or $20 in my bank account, and rent was due 2 days away, and I was getting my paycheck the next day. So by the time I got that paycheck, it was already spent, and I was like, I don't have enough gas, I don't have enough food. Like, what am I gonna do? And I remember that night I was like on the verge of kind of just having a breakdown, and I threw something into the trash can, and I heard what sounded like pop cans crimpling or crumpling. And in my state, you can do a cash return for pop cans, and it was like just enough to put gas in my car and get a meal that night. And it's like, you can, when you're 10 to 20 cents off, it's very hard to explain away. Yeah, it could be, it's coincidental, but when you look at the overarching theme of your life, those things seem to happen when you're really down and out. And if you're not deliberate about looking for those things.
No kidding. That story reminds me of a time that my youth pastor, when I was in high school, told me about. He was a military guy, and his son had a softball game that he wanted to attend. And he's looking at the pile of paperwork that the military had pushed on him, and his son's game was in an hour. He had, like he said, about 8 hours worth of paperwork to do. And he had promised his son he'd go to the game, but at the same time, his commander is telling him, I don't care what you promised your son, this has to be done today. And so, he prays to God, I don't know what to do about this. How can I resolve this problem? And then he just sits down, 8 hours straight, cranks it out. And when he looks up at the clock, only 5 minutes had gone by.
Yeah. Yep.
And so, like, these things do happen. I fully believe that story. But it's just incredible. And there's no way that you can psychologically confuse 8 hours and 5 minutes. Right. And the paperwork is there to prove it. So it's just fun to know when you see these stories that God is active. He's there. He's not like writing in the stars and saying, hey, that was me who did that, right? God doesn't feel the pressure to try to take credit for every single thing he does. And yet when we need him, he's there.
Correct. Yep.
But you were going to go back, and I kind of derailed you with that angelic influence question.
Yeah.
But you were going to talk about not just the one reason for what you think is the enemy's overarching plan, but you made it seem like there might have been something else you were going to touch on with that.
Yeah. When I think of that, there's a handful of little pieces to that puzzle. The first is illegitimizing spirituality. The second is building divisiveness and ineffective leadership in the church, which, again, you can go through my post history and you're going to see me kind of bag on the church a little bit about that, or at least the church leadership local to me has been really ineffective at leading its people. That's the second leg. And then the third leg, would be, and the kind of another red pill theme is flipping the social hierarchy, or not social hierarchy, I'm not sure what word I want to use for it, but where you start screwing with the order of who put whom in charge, and where you see men putting their wives on these pedestals, and they're um, we had friends over recently, and every once in a while I'll kind of get under their skin just because I like to do that. And I'll say something like, "Oh, if my wife's wrong about something, I'll tell her." And all of the wives are like, "Oh, my husband would never talk to me that way." And it's like, really? Like, if my wife is wrong, the best thing I can do for her is to help correct her, because when she dies and she's in front of God in the heavenly courts, I it will have been a benefit to her for me to help her stop sinning, because I'm not going to be the one taking her sin for her. Nobody is going to have to answer for her but her. Um, and so all of these things, he's undermining the household, he's undermining leadership in church, and he's making the whole idea of the spiritual realm um, either taboo, or he's making it almost lunacy to talk about. And those
So
would
you
be
don't
like,
think God will have a point where he looks at a husband and says, I entrusted her to you, I put her under your authority. Well, why didn't you do something about this? You
no,
don't think that's going to happen?
I do. I mean, there's going to be sins that where I fall short that he's definitely going to address it. Kind of like where it says that love doesn't divide and multiplies, and sin acts the same way. Sin doesn't divide and multiplies. Where I fell short as a husband leading her, I will have to atone for that in the same way that where my wife fell short, she will also have to atone for that. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. I
Yeah.
completely agree with that. And I was kind of speaking a little misleading anyway,
Oh,
because I
good.
don't even get the impression in scripture that everybody wants to talk about, oh, when we die and go to judgment day, there's going to be this big screen TV portraying all of your sins. And, do
No.
you want everybody seeing all those sins? Like, that's not found in scripture anywhere.
Yeah,
The Bible does say that each person will be judged according to what they do. But Romans 2 makes it very clear that, to those who are in faith, pursue things like honor and glory, that they will be rewarded with immortality, right? It doesn't say that they're going to be judged by their sin. It says that they will be judged by the things that they sought in Christ. And then at the same time, the non-believers, it does say that they will be punished for and be judged by their sin. And so it's a huge split with how that punishment's going to happen. And so a lot of believers have this guilt trip mentality about the judgment and how we should approach it. And that's one of the ploys I think the enemy does put out there, right? Is that they want, the demonic forces want us so caught up in the idea of, are we sinning, are we not sinning, that we lose track of the actual goal. And what is the actual goal of the Christian?
Are you asking that rhetorically, or are you?
I'm asking you genuinely.
Genuinely. So, obviously, our primary, I would say, our like 2 or 3 primary focuses are for reasons to be put on earth. First is for the glorification of God. Second would be for spiritual reproduction, something that I think the whole sub that's something that we regularly focus on.
Right, which I would call the method by which we glorify God.
Correct, yeah. So I said 2 or 3, and I'm going to say that it's just those 2. But
so it reminds me, I used to do a lot of just journaling and blog writing and things even way before my RPC days. And there was something that at one point I'd written down that I wrote in the vein of the Screwtape letters. And I just called it Screwtape, one of Screwtape's lost letters, right? As something that I wish was in the book, but never quite saw in there. But it kind of outlines my view of how I believe the demonic forces are trying to manipulate the church, right? And so this is something I wrote probably 8 years ago, at least. I could be even further back than that. But it essentially says, my dear Wormwood, do not let the subject realize the extent of his own freedom. He is no longer bound by sin, but he only knows this in his head. If you can keep him from experiencing it in his heart, you will win the war over him in due time.
Mm-hmm.
Humans are pathetically dumb-witted. They at first rely on God for their salvation, but are easily taught to believe that everything after this can be accomplished by their own power. Take advantage of this gap in their teaching, for few have told them otherwise. Few have even realized that our enemy's work continues in specific ways after they have first come to know him.
Mm-hmm.
Convince him then that work is only general, and they will never think to let our adversary assist them in specific ways. Keep them praying for those general results that they want, but never let them think to ask in their prayers for a specific means of how that result will be accomplished. As long as they continue in generalities, you can easily convince them that coincidence can explain the answers to their prayers. If you can convince them of this, you are only a step away from achieving in them a fear of praying for specifics, for they will worry that if they are too specific, they might end up proving that prayer does not work, or even better, that our enemy isn't hearing them or even real in the first place. Although you may win specific grounds, and this, I guess, is the part where it really tags onto what we're talking about here. Although you may win significant ground with the subject, if you can cause his prayers to fail, do not be tricked by our adversaries into allowing such specific prayers to continue, Wormwood. This is a trap they have laid for us, for you never know when our foe may decide to defy the odds in order to reaffirm the subject's faith. No, you are better off letting him speculate about whether or not his specific prayers will be answered. This keeps the subject out of the enemy's hands and into yours. And that fear of praying specifically will fester into doubt, and that doubt can be exploited. I guess I was wrong. This is where it starts. But above all else, Wormwood, remember that our goal is not to keep him in sin. Rather, the sin is only a tool to accomplish our true purpose, to keep him from fighting the enemy's battles or winning souls.
Mm-hmm.
Once he tastes the delicious fruit of victory, stealing those who belong to us, he may never stop fighting again. Never let him experience this joy. Make him think that the battle is against sin. Then, when he wins, he will feel a shallow sense of satisfaction, and we will have suffered no losses. Let him keep winning in this way from time to time, so that he will continue to think this is the way to beat us and never look to the true battlefront. And even if he does manage to win a soul or two along the way, make him quickly forget them. Let him believe that it is enough that the new convert attends a church service regularly, or that attending a study group or serving on a committee will somehow be enough. But always keep the relationship shallow. Of course, you are better off never to let him this far in the first place. Moreover, if you can keep your subject fixated on his sin, he will become confused about whether or not he is actually free from sin himself, and he will not be concerned about whether his neighbor is free from sin. If you can do this, he will forget his role in this war. He will be fruitless, and that, my dear nephew, is what will be most helpful to our cause. Whether or not he sins is of no consequence, for you know that he won't be judged by that sin, nor do we gain anything by increasing sin. Our victory is not in sin, for sin's work was made complete when it first entered the world and condemned them all to die. The only matter of consequence since their curse is whether or not we allow our adversary to save them from that sin. Or to be more specific, our victory is not in sin itself, but in those who we keep from the enemy. Take advantage of his sin for this purpose if you can, but always keep your eyes fixated on whatever will keep him inactive from the true battle. Use all the tools I have given you to accomplish this goal, and not sin alone. So, a little lengthy, but
no, hey, that's a good word. I like that a lot. So,
but it pushes the idea that ultimately the enemy knows that the real battle is over how many people are going to be saved versus going to hell, right?
mm-hmm.
This is a war over souls. And so many Christians forget that it's a war over souls and instead want to focus on these peripheral aspects of our faith. And while those peripheral aspects are very important and can be helpful in winning souls, they are not the goal in themselves.
Correct.
And I think that that's one of the enemy's biggest strategies, is to mislead us into that direction. And, you know, in law, I call it the smokescreen strategy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if I have a deadlock winning argument that cannot be defeated in court, and the opposing counsel knows it. What's their strategy?
They just make
Are they
everything
going to
so
fight and argue?
confusing,
Right. You can't fight and argue against what you know to be clear, victorious law.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead, their strategy is to put in so many peripheral things and side issues that the actual meat of the case gets lost behind all of it. And that is so easy to confuse a jury and sometimes even judges over all those peripheral issues that the case itself becomes obfuscated.
Mm-hmm.
And then the underlying legal issue that really needs to be addressed gets handled incorrectly because of all the peripherals.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the enemy is trying to do. It's a big smokescreen argument because Satan knows he can't beat God. I mean, he's God. You can't beat him. You can't win. And so the best thing he can do is obfuscate the issues by creating all kinds of peripheral things and telling us that's what you Christians need to be focusing on. And in this, the enemy's primary strategy is not necessarily to scare people with all the hocus pocus phooey of, demonic possessions and poltergeist activity and things like that, right? That does happen from time to time, but the majority is by actually becoming the wolf in sheep's clothing that infiltrates the church and tries to undermine what the church has to say about anything of significance by leading them in different directions. And that's where, we talk a lot about the feminization of the church on RPC is one of the big things that has happened in order to lead the church down the wrong path. Right. And so there's all kinds of these, and that's just one of many, many examples. But the idea of, all these churches that are so focused on stop sinning, stop sinning, stop sinning, right? It's great. You should stop sinning. That is a part of the Christian life. But when you put so much emphasis on that, you're completely missing the point.
Yeah. Well, the idea of this, the hyper focus of stop sinning, that comes out of spiritual maturity, whereas it's almost more like just like you said, that the Chewbacca case where they just start making stuff up, and they're not making stuff up, but they obfuscate the truth. And what is really going to liberate you spiritually is not, if you can just get rid of this one more sin, if you can just get rid of this one more sin, then you'll be saved. If you can just get rid of this one more sin, well, no, there will always be sin. And not to say don't fight it at all, but if you're so focused on that, then you're not focused on any of the other things. I mean, how much of the Bible talks about sin? How much of the Bible talks about Jesus?
Tell you how many times I have heard guys say, if I could just stop doing porn, I would be a perfect guy.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing else would ever, I would never sin again because that's the one thing. Anything else I can handle. I just can't get over this one thing.
Yeah.
Every single time I try to tell them, dude, I've been there. I've overcome it. It's not an issue anymore. But I'm telling you, as soon as you overcome that hill, there are 15 other ones right behind it, way worse than that was, that you didn't even know you were doing until you were able to get past the thing sitting right in front of your eyes. Right. And then all of a sudden you see these other things going on, and every one of them rejects that and says, oh, no, that's not true at all. I have no other sins. If I could just do this, I'd be perfect.
Yeah, okay, guy. That's the secret, isn't it? Yeah. So that's more or less, if I could target what I believe the larger idea of Satan, kind of like what you're saying, obfuscate the truth, make it so it's so convoluted that people can't nail it down, which is why spiritual precision and just your precision of language when you're talking about things, especially like this, because these conversations can go one of two ways. You can have the constructive conversation about spirituality and spiritual warfare. You can have the ones that just even more so emphasize the incredulity of it, the ineffectivity of prayer, like accidentally saying stuff like that. That's the bad side of it. So how do we make sure that we're being precise with what we're saying? How do we make sure that our focus is on having understanding for the promises Christ gives us? Um,
So now we've talked a lot about the bad side of things, kind of like
mhm.
you referenced a little bit. What is kind of the other end of the spiritualistic aspect of the faith? And what I'm talking about here specifically is healing, deliverance, those types of things. Tell
Mhm.
me a little bit about your understanding of those things.
So,
Obviously, I'm assuming that you are not a cessationist. I'm not either.
so spiritual healing. Uh, but I'll go in order for you. So, um, talking specifically about spiritual healing, there are diseases, there are sicknesses, there are physical maladies that the enemy can put on you, um, as a way to derail and unfocus your sight on God. And if he can do that, he makes you ineffective as a Christian. If you can be a very powerful, strong Christian and he can blight you with cancer, and then the rest of your life is so focused on cancer that it's no longer focused on um, spreading the gospel and evangelizing. So um, there are times where if that is the situation, some of those things can be remedied. Not going to say
So,
always because I don't. Oh,
so
continue.
that's exactly what I was going to ask then. I know a handful of people who tend to hold this view, and I see this happen on other Christian subreddits like True Christian a lot. It comes up every now and then, where somebody will say something to the effect of, oh, well, the only reason that you're not healed yet is because you don't have enough faith,
Mm,
right? Or there's one guy who was going around saying that Christians shouldn't fear the coronavirus. Not to say that I kind of actually agree that we shouldn't fear it. I'm not worried all that much myself, but what his point was, I disagree with, is because God won't let you get it because God takes care of Christians and Christians are never subject to illness. And if you do
correct.
get an illness, then you must not be a Christian. Or maybe you are, but you just don't have enough faith and you're weak and you're a child.
Correct. Yeah. So when I think about that situation, so we have. I'll manufacture a story for you real quick. So somebody is diagnosed with cancer. Um, there are a few ways it could go. If the person is um, healed of cancer um, spiritually, they go to the doctor and the doctor says, "Oh my gosh, like I don't know how. It there's no reason. You're not on medication. There's no scientific reason that I can say that um, you're healed, but you are." That person can go and they tell everybody, and wonderful. That's one avenue for it.
And I'll say that that's not just a hypothetical situation, by the way, and
Correct.
it
Yep.
happens in extreme ways. The previous congregation I was a part of, there was a couple who had been trying for a long time to get pregnant, having great difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, they did get pregnant, and they had a miscarriage partway through, where the doctor said that the baby is still in there, but the baby is dead. There
Mm-hmm.
is no heartbeat. The tissue matter is not growing, and within a couple weeks, you will pass the tissue matter and it will move on. It's kind of how the doctor approached it. They didn't want to believe the doctor, so they went and got a second opinion from another doctor who did a number of a greater set of tests, and came to the exact same conclusion. Sorry, your baby's dead. And
Right.
I probably a few days, I can't remember exactly how the timeline worked of it, but a couple days later, they're at a special conference where there was a guest speaker at the church who was talking and praying over people at a different time. They shared their story and how upset they were, and that they wanted emotional release from the situation, to be able to feel alive again and not all this sad grief and depression. And he said, I've got something better for you. I'm just going to pray over you. And he, of course, says, and now your baby is healed and alive. And they're obviously very skeptical, thinking this is a cruel joke. Why would you say something like that and give us this false hope? Sure enough, they go to the doctor 2 weeks later because the tissue matter had not passed. And the doctor says, I don't know how this has happened, but your baby is alive and well. Like, you don't have two independent doctors run a battery of tests and come to the same conclusion. Doctors don't tell you your baby is dead lightly, right?
Right.
They're
Yeah.
going to make darn sure that that thing is actually deceased before they come to that conclusion, because they know how sensitive that is. And so I'm just saying that those types of situations are real. And part of the fun of this conversation, I guess, is sharing those stories as we have the chance.
Yeah. So, like, just piggybacking off of your story. So, there are a number of other scenarios, whether psychological things that could go into, like my grandpa, for example, had a lot of really, really traumatic stuff happen as a child, and had been praying for it for a very long time, but that some of the anxiety, anger, and hurt from that would go away. And he would be able to explain it better than I would, but there was a day he was camping, because that's what all Dutch people do. And he was praying about it, and he felt a huge wind blow over him, and he could specifically name the hurts that were healed in that moment, and he hasn't faced those same things since. So whether it is a real physical malady, cancer, the death of an unborn child, or a mental, emotional thing, the whole gambit of things can be healed. And we usually, when we see those, at least when I see people physically or mentally healed, it is usually it's adjacent to people coming to faith. So what I mean by that is, I see God healing people almost exclusively when it will positively impact the people around them's faith, if that makes sense.
So not just for yourself, but for the benefit of those around. Kind of like Paul says, the spiritual gifts are expressed not necessarily for your own good, but for the entire benefit of the church, right?
Correct, yep. So that's one side of it. You have people who are healed. The other side of the coin is people who are not healed and are so detracted by their malady that they become ineffective Christians. And then the middle ground is these people who kind of get put in the situation of, I have this thing, and it is not necessarily because of demonic oppression. It's just because of the sin nature of earth. We screwed everything up at the back of the fall, and I have cancer now. And they pray for it, and they don't see anything come of it. And not that they should necessarily stop praying for it, but the really profoundly spiritually mature people are able to use that sickness to continue to further the kingdom. And that is like almost as influential as when people are fully healed. The people who are spiritually mature and can act spiritually mature in those situations where their body is failing them, and they can still say like, hey, God is good. Despite the fact that my lungs are literally trying to kill me, despite the fact that part of my liver cancer broke off and went into my brain, like, despite all that, God is good, I think speaks equally highly or even more highly of the Lord that they're following, if that makes sense. So
yeah,
those are kind of like the three behaviors I see people who are looking for healing, the three ways that those really turn out. And obviously there's a broad spectrum of in between, somebody who's partially healed or whatever.
Right. So the question that always gets raised in this situation is, okay, so you believe the gift of healing is a real gift.
Mm-hmm.
Why doesn't somebody with the gift of healing just go through the hospitals, touching everybody, healing everybody left and right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's one that people definitely struggle with. And for me personally, when I think of that, I don't see if God's ultimate goal is. Let me step back for a second. So it is my belief and what I've seen in the Bible that God's goal is not to make it so that more people are alive on this in this life, but rather that there are more people alive in the next one. So when we start to
So how would you reconcile that with the people who are eventually healed, but not immediately?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's clear that God does still want them on the earth,
Mm-hmm.
and yet for some reason, here they are still sick.
So how would I reconcile that? Good question. Let me think about that for a second. I don't believe. Give me a second to think about that. Let's come back to that. What would your answer to that be?
I'll take a tangent on this and kind of talk more generally about the idea of healing, right? So the first thing that comes to mind is Epaphroditus. In the book of Philippians, Paul talks about how Epaphroditus was the messenger from Philippi that brought good gifts from the Philippians to him, and that he became deathly ill, right? And at one point he even talks about, you guys need to honor guys like Epaphroditus, who risked his life and almost died for the cause of the gospel. And so Paul is the same guy who in the book of Acts, they're saying that people were being healed just by reaching out and touching his shadow, right? And so in all of this, I see that Paul has the gift of healing, and yet at the same time, we have a believer who is genuine, who is bringing, financial support to Paul. And Paul talks about what a great love and blessing he was, and that he's weeping over Epaphroditus, very sorrowful that he was afraid he might not be able to send him back to the Philippians. And so why didn't Paul just heal him? Mm-hmm. It's not that, right? And so that it gives this idea that just because you have the gift of healing doesn't mean you can go around healing anybody you want to. And so what's the condition of healing? And when I look at the ministry of Jesus, right, he's going around healing all kinds of people left and right. What happens when he goes to his hometown?
Doesn't happen, right? Yep.
Why? Because we're talking about Jesus himself, the healer of all healers, God incarnate. Are you really going to say Jesus didn't have enough faith to heal those people?
Right. Yeah.
So what's the answer there? Why couldn't Jesus heal people from his own town?
An easy answer would be to say their own lack of faith, or their in desire to see themselves healed in some strange kind of way.
Right, and so the passage itself says that they didn't really acknowledge Jesus as God or Lord, and instead they're basically saying, aren't you the carpenter, the kid that we grew up with, and we know who you are, how are you calling yourself some Messiah? Mm-hmm. And so another thing that I start to see in Jesus's ministry, and I'm willing to be corrected on this because I have not specifically studied it before, but can you think of one time that Jesus ever healed a non-believer who didn't become saved as a result of the process?
Right. Not offhand. What with the Roman centurion who sent somebody? Does it say that he believed afterward? He
Jesus did say that he had great faith, so we have to assume that his faith was in Christ's ability. So I have to imagine that Jesus would not be complimenting on him on his faith if it was a false faith.
Right.
So in this, my suspicion is that healing is not for the non-Christians, but it is specifically reserved for God's own people.
Mm-hmm.
Or those who
if I come up with it, yeah, correct. If I come up with one, I'll make sure to comment or post one of them.
Yeah, I would love to know, because I've not studied it, so I'm welcome to be corrected on that, but I can't think off the top of my head of a situation where a non-believer was healed without some kind of conversion happening, or even people around being converted or something.
Mm-hmm. Going back to that question about why wouldn't somebody just go through the Bible or go through the hospital healing, and when I think of that, it just kind of like what you just said. First off, there is some reservations about when and how it happens. That the people, even you look back, like the woman who just touches Jesus's cloak and is healed, and she was like, if I remember, she had been menstruating for like years or something crazy like that, and was healed. So there has to be an active pursuing of Christ.
So that was the exact next thing I was going to get to.
Yeah.
Can you think of any examples? And again, I'm welcome to be corrected on this. I do not know. I haven't studied it. But can you think of any examples where Jesus healed somebody who wasn't asking for it?
Yeah.
Right? Because to me, every time I see this, I see a guy, being lowered down through the roof in the middle of Jesus teaching this crowd just so that he could be healed. I see the guy at the well who's shouting out, son of David, right? Asking for it. I see blind people left and right, lepers, the lady who's touching his cloak. All of these people are going after Jesus. But do we see Jesus specifically going out of his way to look for somebody to heal? And yet this is what I see a lot of the faith healers today in this spiritualized healing movement, right? Are out there.
Snake oil, yeah.
Right. They're not following the model Jesus gave of making disciples and healing those who come along the way of fulfilling their mission. Instead, they're making healing their mission, and they're going out of their way to look for opportunities. And I just don't see Jesus doing that.
Yeah.
And I could be wrong, but I don't think I am.
You're right. That's like when you talk about how sin just, or I shouldn't even say sin. So the enemy is so good at misdirecting something. He's very good at putting things that seem like really good things as the primary thing, where
avoiding sin, like we were talking about before, right? Hey, correct. It's great to avoid sin. Let's make that the primary goal of the Christian walk.
Correct. It almost becomes a conversation of like, instead of Jesus who can heal, it becomes the healer Jesus, and there's so much emphasis on these other things. Well, no, let's talk about what really is the main thing.
Which of course validates the old saying that the second best is the enemy of the best.
Correct, yeah. So yeah, just a lot of interesting points, and I'm definitely open to the community if they have questions about XYZ thing. If I don't have an answer to it, obviously I'm not going to try to tout that I'm some spiritual savant. I don't think anybody who says that I'd immediately be questionable of, but there's a lot of good resources out there too for if you feel like you're experiencing it. I think there was somebody I was messaging on the RPC subreddit that was having some instances like that. Some intercession stuff, and this is something I can ask you as well, because it sounded like you had done some stuff with intercessory work, or
yeah, so I was part of a team a little over a year ago that I was designed to put together a conference for I don't know exactly how you would want to word it other than inner healing type ministry.
What ministry was it?
It was through the congregation I was attending at the time. So it wasn't a separate ministry for that. It was the pastor basically said, hey, you guys have attended conferences on this stuff. We really want you to be able to share what you've learned with our congregation and help walk people through these deep wounds that they're struggling through.
Yeah. Is this more like oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Was this more like psychological stuff, or like the internal wounds, or
physical and internal?
Okay.
Right. So there were some people who were coming with certain types of pains, chronic illnesses, and whatnot. But there were also people who were coming who were saying, I've never been fine since my dad died, or ever since I got divorced, I've been sad and I can't get over this. How can I get over this? Right. And so there was a team of us trying to put all kinds of content and ultimately organize this conference. And the majority of us, I think all of us from the team, ended up being speakers at the event. And my function within the team was to keep people biblically grounded, because it is so easy for people in that type of an environment to go into what I would call theology, right? Which is kind of like psychology, but twisted to look like theology. And so there's a lot of conversations that would come up where people would start talking about generational iniquities and mother-father wounds and strongholds, and a lot of them use biblical concepts, but then the primary teachings that surround those biblical concepts aren't from scripture, but from psychological resources.
Yeah.
And so that's what really kind of pushed me away. And I kept saying, no, let's get back on track.
Yeah.
And I was very grateful that for the most part, the group was on board with saying, you're right, we got to stay scripturally grounded. And they were very receptive to that. But that was kind of my experience with being involved in, an inner healing type ministry.
So the intercessory work that I have done, just so I'm not, sounds like you have a lot longer hours than I am. How much longer are we good to be on here for? Because I could stretch this out.
Well, I mean, it's up to you.
Okay.
I've started my second 5K just walking around.
Okay. So the intercessory work that I've at least been a part of, just to give, if there are any of you guys that are on the forums that are curious about it, to give just an insight or kind of a glimpse into what it has looked like, at least for me, or when I've been a part of it. It starts off usually with a lot of prayer. So when we talk about ways that the enemy can divert or distract or leads people away from being spiritually liberated or freed from bondage, a lot of times what you'll see is people they'll show up late, people will forget like paperwork, or they'll forget Bibles. We've had people who just lose time. They're like, I got in my car and it was 11 o'clock and we were supposed to be here at 11:30, and it was like, I don't know how it took me an hour to drive 15 minutes. So kind of bizarre things like that to try to derail the team of people who are going to be leading them through intercessory. So, or who are going to be the intercessory team for them. So those are some of the interesting things. Starts off with a lot of prayer, even before it happens, from the group, just to make sure that everybody's staying, kind of like what Red's saying, spiritually grounded, that there's no personal things like, oh, I believe Jesus is this way, even though the Bible says this. So starts off with a lot of scripture. The person will come in and it usually will go over, there's a pretty long list of things like, okay, like sexual sin, like gossiping sin, just a huge list of sins. We talk like they have to go through all of them. A lot of times you'll see people they'll be talking about something that happened a month ago, and then something way back when comes up, and you specifically begin to pray over those things and you speak truth into them, and then you address the sin, and then a lot of times you'll address the enemy, saying like, this aspect of their life, Satan, you need to get out, or whatever colloquial language you guys want to use for it. But that will go on for typically about 2 to 3 hours. Sometimes weird stuff happens, but a lot of times you get into just a lot of the trauma that people face, a lot of trauma people face, and then a lot of just like the spiritual misconceptions people have, like if they grew up in a congregation that was really guilt focused, or they used guilt to keep people in line instead of their love of Christ helps them keep themselves in line. A lot of that has to be spoken into, because there's just stuff that they get told at some point and they just accept it as truth, and they're not thinking consciously about it, so that stuff just becomes a part of how they view Christ, and it misconstrues the truths that we're given as followers. So that's kind of what it looks like, long strand, if that makes sense. So
yeah, so the group that I was with, I think that their standard, I don't know that they would define that they have a process, but what they were doing was extremely similar to what's known as theophostic prayer ministry. not something that I would put my stamp of approval on, but I think that these people their hearts were in the right place at least.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea there is when somebody has a wound that they're trying to get through the struggle of, such as a divorce or the death of a parent or somebody who had betrayed them, whatever it is, they will ask that person, well, first off, of course, they talk about the situation openly just to figure out a little bit of what's actually gone on. They quote scripture where it's appropriate, and then eventually they say, can we pray over you? And during the prayer process, they will ask them to envision themselves kind of reliving that moment, and then ultimately say, and not necessarily in a psychoanalytic, let's relive the experience and see if we can
I was
discover
just
new
about to
joy.
say something from that. Yeah.
It can get, and that's where true theophostic prayer ministry, if done incorrectly, can easily go down that road. It is also dangerous because it can potentially create, what we'd call from the movie Inception or thought implantation, where the person going through it can reorganize how people remember a situation, which can sometimes be healthy, but other times grossly unhealthy. And so there's some of that that's going on, but or that can go on if it's done incorrectly. But the idea here of what they're saying is, relive the situation, don't change the situation, but, if you believe that God is omnipresent, that he's omniscient, he knew what was going on, he was present in that moment, and he allowed it to happen, right? And if you believe that God is good, what do you believe God is saying and communicating and wanting you to understand if you were mature enough to hear and understand and receive it in that moment? Right? Because most people who are going through this are a lot more mature than they were when they were going through their wound.
Correct.
And so at that point, you can now be able to say, hey, now that I know God better, I didn't know back then who God was or why he would allow these things to happen. But now that I am and have this capacity to understand these things, I can go ahead and say, oh, I never thought about it before, but you're right. God was there in that moment. This is what he wanted me to know and understand. I just wasn't in a position to receive and hear what he was trying to say or why he could use this for the greater good.
Correct.
And so I had one lady who was from a couple congregations ago that I attended. It was very sad. She at one point was up front sharing her story about how she had been raped, right? And this is a legitimate rape. This is not like one of those, women cry rape situations. She was legitimately, that happened to her. So in the midst of that, that obviously is going to cause some very real trauma. And it's a horrific thing. And it can cause some serious mental breakdown. And for a long time, she was questioning God, like, why would you let me experience something like that? And eventually, she was able to move past it and get along. And some other girl who had been raped, I had connected with her and started asking questions. How did you get past this? How is it that you can love God after he let that happen to you? And she was able to minister to that person and help her become more grounded in the faith and receive what God would have to say to her. And then, of course, that lady brings to her other friends who she knew who had been through that same situation. And next thing you know, because of her horrific experience, she's got several other women, a whole ministry of, I think she eventually started, of just reaching out to people who had been through that shared experience, and she was able to bring them to Christ. And so that is not to say that God caused a bad thing to happen in order for that good to result, but instead, when Romans 8 talks about how God works all things for the good of those who love him, that's something where he's able to take a horrific situation, silver lining it, right, and say, what the enemy meant for evil, I mean for good. And so I don't know how that necessarily fits in exactly what you're saying, but it's one of those things that we always want to remember, what is the real situation here and how is God going to use this, rather than just thinking about our own pain in the moment, which is ultimately going to hinder us and pull us away.
Yeah, and I think how that really ultimately connects is through the speaking of truth and into this you were saying she was questioning whether or not God was good. Well, yes, and this is how. And it just, unfortunately for her, she wasn't at the point where she was working with those women, and she couldn't see the other side of, well, at some point this is going to be used for this, and this is why, in the grand scheme of things, this will be a blessing. So, and I'm saying that trying to be pretty cautious, because I know you don't want to say that in the moment when they're traumatized and they're like, this just happened. But ultimately, she was able to bless others through that event. So I am curious as to what your reservations to you said theophostic prayer. What are your reservations on that? Or is it just how it becomes kind of funny?
I don't like the idea of memory implantation,
okay,
which is not part of theophostic prayer ministry, but those who are not adequately trained will inevitably go that direction.
Yep.
So that's one. And most people who practice it are not actually trained to do it. They're people who had it done to them and they think, oh, that was so powerful, let me go do that for somebody else. And they just make mistakes.
Yep. Okay.
Two, it mixes too much psychoanalysis into the process, and some of the methodology is not necessarily, and this is at least for true theophostic prayer ministry, not necessarily the group that I was with, but true theophostic prayer ministry, it was developed by a counselor who intentionally said, how can I take what I've learned from my secular counseling degree and use that in order to help work things for good for God. And so he ended up saying, well, what if I start praying with people and doing counseling at the same time? And he's trying to blend secular and spiritual concepts, which isn't always bad, but there's a danger when you do that, especially when you don't know how to stay scripturally grounded in the process. And then third is that most theophostic prayer ministry all has somebody involved who claims to be some kind of a prophet and will end up saying, I'm getting a word of this, or I'm getting a word of that. And they'll start blurting things out. And a lot of times, not to say that I'm against prophecy one bit, but there's a lot of people who go with their own emotional feelings, or they take a thought that pops in their head and say, well, it popped in my head during prayer, therefore it must be from God. When in reality, it's just their own concoction.
Yeah.
And so I really have a lot of skepticism for that. So those are my three big reservations about how theophostic prayer ministry is done in practice. I don't necessarily have any reservations about how it can be done in an idyllic situation.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that answers my question on that then. Well, sweet. Do you have anything else? Otherwise, I can at least let you get some sleep before you have another big day tomorrow, I bet.
Well, today was busy enough. I had spent, goodness, it was my first time going back to court since probably February to have an in-person appearance. I've had Zoom hearings and stuff, but I had that this morning and then spent several hours working on the playground that I've been building for my kids. This thing is massive. It's taking a lot of energy, but holy cow, today was hot. And then as soon as I had spent however many, I think I got home right around 12:15, so it must have been about 7 hours that I worked on that, and then went off and ran 6 miles with my kids. So it's been a long day. But all of that being said, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. And
absolutely.
I know you had a list of questions. Did we address everything?
I think just about it. If not, I can when we post it, I can just I can ask those questions in there, and then other people can kind of include whatever they think. You can get somebody tell me I'm a stupid idiot and that they disagree with everything I say, and that's okay too.
Yep. Well, I appreciate it. You gave me another 6 miles into my exercise for the day. So
good.
If anything else does come up, I'll look forward to hearing from you, but it's been a pleasure chatting.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, I'll catch you later, brother.
Cool, thank you. Bye.